draft, its own area. Now, that Constitution wasn't fully ratified as a separate state until after the Declaration of Independence and in specific order, but they recognized their need to do this. So, when you have in the same actual motion that is given on the floor, for instance, if you look at this, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to read certain sections of it very quickly here that would be probably very familiar to you, we could say the following, that this Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, our first national constitution, were actually brought forth in the same breath. In fact, June 7, 1776, this is the first, Richard Henry Lee brings forth the proposition. This is what he says. He brings forth this motion. I move that the colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that a plan of confederation be prepared and transmitted to the respective colonies for their consideration and approbation. So in the very same motion, a charter for the definition of the United States of America was drafted. In the very same motion, the Articles of Confederation, the constitutional bylaws that would protect that charter, were there. Could anything be clearer than the two were two sides of the same coin? Drafted in the same motion, understood for the same purpose. You know, we need a united declaration of independence that every colony now, we need to tell the world, because King George won't tell the world what he did August 23rd. He's not going to tell them that he severed the relationship with the colonies. We're going to tell the whole world why we are independent and have a right, ought to be independent. We're going to reclaim our natural charter as human beings under the creation of God, and we're going to claim that as that charter, but also we don't just need a charter. What do we need? We need a set of bylaws to protect it, and we're going to have a confederation. And so they do this. Now, it's interesting that we could then have a couple of subpoints. First of all, the Declaration of Independence, as a long pattern that precedes it from all the English colonies that come here, and it simply says this: a colony, a group of people, can sever its relationship to its former government lawfully. If you cannot secede lawfully, then what hope is there other than force? You can secede. This was the declaration. A charter says, you know what? You can do this. Now, England didn't say this, because did England accept the secession of the colonies? No. And what did it do to prove it? No legal arguments, just arguments by force. And they sent the troops in to say, even though we have no relationship with you anymore, even though you are now abandoned children, you have no parent, your father has disowned you, you are cut off, can't leave. Because you have certain financial benefits to the parent, and we want your taxes, but we don't want your constitutional arguments. So they send down the troops. And of course, the Declaration of Independence was critical in this regard, because remember, during this whole debate period in 1775 and 1776, battles are going on. We've got Lexington, Concord, Salem. You've got the stores. You've got, even before that, a year before that, in Williamsburg. You've got all kinds of conflict taking place in the colonies already. So when that Continental Congress meets in 1775, it has work to do. But in 1776, the third year of the Continental Congress, just before, a committee was formed on June 12, 5 days after that motion was made, consisting of one member from every one of the 13 colonies to draft a confederation, a set of bylaws. It was not fully ratified by all 13 colonies, though it was in effect once the majority had ratified it. But it was not in effect. They had to have unanimous decisions to deal with it. It was not in full effect till 1781. Actually, the year that there would be the surrender down in Virginia of the American Revolution, though we know troops were not even dismantled till 1783. But the idea is, you had this during the entire time of the American Revolution. You had a bylaw and a confederation being formed as a compact of the various states. So you could have a secession. Second, any colony has a separate and equal station, a right to independence from the laws of nature and of nature's God. There has to be some way for you to reclaim that. Third, in essence, the Declaration was a call for a set of bylaws. a set of bylaws that would be enacted. That first set of bylaws was the Articles of Confederation. Now, when we have the Articles of Confederation and they begin to operate, the Articles, they were well named. It was a confederated government. A confederated government is a loose compact of states and leaves all the states in their complete and existing sovereignty, except for the very specific areas they yield to the federal head. And thus, it was a compact of states. That compact of states governed during the American Revolution. The compact of states was seen by many not to have enough powers to be able to unite the complete colonies. Thus, what ended up happening, and you know the story then, several years later, after the tumultuous 1780s, there was a call for a new constitutional convention. And that new constitutional convention called people into Philadelphia in May of 1787. The delegates who came to that convention had specific instructions to amend the Articles of Confederation, but not to rewrite a new charter. In fact, the idea was that you were going to amend the Articles of Confederation, and whatever you came out with would replace the Articles, but not replace what? The charter. The charter was not replaced. In fact, the Constitution became the more perfect union of the Articles of Confederation, but did not in any way repudiate the Declaration of Independence. It still rested on it, just to make sure everybody understood that, because all the debates covered most of the bases. It's nice to look back more than 200 years now, and there are a few things I wish they debated at the Constitutional Convention more thoroughly and everything else, but I've got the benefit of a lot of years. But the idea would be simply this. When that took place, and that new set of bylaws, it at no time repudiated the Declaration of Independence, and to make sure of that, the colonists put this at the end of the Constitution. Done in convention, by the unanimous consent of the states present, 17th day of September in the year of our Lord 1787, and of the independence of the United States, the 12th. Oh, that's just rhetoric, isn't it? That's not significant. It's very significant. Because it dated the Constitution and it linked it inseparably with what? The Declaration of Independence. In other words, this is in the 12th year of the independence of America. We're not forgetting our charter. The Constitution of the United States in 1787 did not birth a new nation. It changed the bylaws. It amended the bylaws. And some people who are negative about the increased powers, and again, we have hindsight with us. You know, if Patrick Henry smelled a rat, didn't go to the Constitutional Convention, we could go on, and just about all of his warnings have proven him to be better than we thought. But the point is, or I never had a doubt about Patrick Henry, but I have advantage of the years. But dealing with this, you look back and you realize the Constitution of the United States rested squarely on the Declaration as much as the Articles of Confederation rested on the Declaration. Different set of bylaws, different dealings with this. And now we have to ask ourselves a question. This inseparable link, this lawful link between charters and bylaws, this link between what defines your rights and defines the source of your law, because you have no other foundation to appeal from. Remember, the British Constitution left no recourse. Very, very scattered. The only thing at the time of the Boston Tea Party that was written in common law in England is that if you wanted to resist an unjust tax, there was no lawful way to appeal a tax in England on the English Constitution. However, this was in common law. What you had to do was you had to first of all make sure that whatever commodity you didn't want to pay the tax on stayed in port for 30 days. You had to make sure, or 20 days, that was, it did not leave. You had to give the owner the chance to what? Leave with his property and not go bankrupt. Second, you had to guard it. You could not let anyone steal it. Nobody could, if you didn't want to pay the tax, you can't take the commodity. You leave it there. It's tainted with tax. So you leave it there. After that, it's liable for seizure. After those 20 days, liable for seizure. And what you have to do is you have to make a public demonstration in public about the tax that you gave the 20 days notice, and then you have to destroy every bit of the commodity. Nobody can take any. Now the question is, did the colonists follow lawful procedure? They did. They actually left it in port exactly 20 days to the hour. And when Sam Adams stood up in the Old South Church, he said, this meeting could do nothing more to save our country. The public demonstration began. Most people believe it was Paul Revere, probably was, leading the pack. He was always where danger was greatest. And down he went to the street. And what did they do? They had a guard around those ships 24 hours a day. and they actually destroyed every bit of tea as common law would recognize. None of it was landed. Nobody could take any. Nobody could get it without the commodity. The Tory governor, Hutchinson, the one who hated the colonists, who wrote a history of New England and a history of the Boston Tea Party, he stated, I do believe, and you can just hear the monotone voice in the writings, I do believe they have acted in every way constitutional. Like, I was hoping to catch them in some way. Well, why did that happen? Because the colonists were very astute as to the lawful means by which you resist. Unlike today's textbook that simply say, people loved tea, they were greedy, didn't want to pay the tax, started a riot, and stole it all. No, obviously not historically accurate if such an exaggeration was to be made. Well, let me ask you this question then. All right, was this link just lost in the 1700s? No. Well, very soon after, this link became very, very clear. In the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798, when they felt the federal government was going off base and John Adams was in the White House and got upset with everybody's cartoons about him and everything else, he issued an executive order from the White House. Now, he didn't mean by the executive order what the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and his good buddies, who weren't his good buddies at the time, James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote them. But it's interesting, not so much why they wrote it, though it was very important on the First Amendment and everything else, about the fact that you could speak against the government and against individuals without being liable. The issue came down to this. They'd say, where do they rest their case in these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions against the national government? And it built a movement in the North. Most people don't realize it was the northern colonies that started the move for secession in 1810. Because in 1810, they were so upset with Thomas Jefferson's embargo from England to stop them from impressing American soldiers that they decided that the New England states felt they were going to lose the most, and they were threatened secession. But in the Hartford Convention of 1811, when they threatened to secede from the Union, it's interesting to note that during that time, they were threatening it, and they were saying the following. Well, you see, we can leave the Union because the United States Constitution brings us a confederated government. Now, the South said, you can't leave the Union. The government's consolidated. That exact argument would be inverse 20 years from then. But the idea would be, the North said, we can leave because the Constitution is a confederated document. The South said, no, it's consolidated. Well, by 1830, it had been reversed. And in 1830, you might know that the famous debate between Daniel Webster and Robert Hayne took place in Washington, D.C. on the nature of the Constitution and secession. Why do I say this? Because this was going to be a test. Was there a link between the Constitution and the Declaration? Because when you are in a debating battle, how are you going to know exactly where your rights come from if there's no declaration? Because the Constitution doesn't declare it. And therefore, if you read the Constitution separate from the Declaration, your rights come from government. If you read the Constitution separate from the Declaration, you can read just about anything into it because the premises on which the Constitution rests are in the Declaration. In fact, the preamble to the Constitution is a summary of the Declaration. It's a summary of the principles that are already there. It's a link between the two documents in such a way that it should be inseparable. Well, in 1830, I think this is very interesting because James Madison was up there in years, but he's the architect of the Constitution. He had something to say about this debate. Because, you might know this, Daniel Webster said the Constitution was a consolidated government, therefore nobody could secede. It was like a marriage. And since God hates divorce, the South can't leave the Union. Now, that's a very simple. I'm not doing justice to Daniel Webster, and he's from New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and that's okay. But still, Daniel Webster was in error. The government was not a consolidated government, meaning there are no state rights. Now, he wouldn't say there were no state rights, but the problem is, Robert Hayne got up in 1830 in this big debate. People would have paid admission for this. This was the Super Bowl of 1830. And they came, and Robert Hayne said, no, it's a confederated document. Any one state can nullify any act of Congress and leave the Union if it wishes over any issue because we came in under a confederated idea. We can leave under a confederated idea. Now, both ideas were extremes. Dear old James Madison, he wrote a letter to both of them. And this is what he said. And I think it's important because I think you need to see that this was not something that's just high and mighty, or we just pull out